Okay, just about to get started. Okay, just about to get. All right, hi everybody. This is Paul Grand, I'm CEO here at MedTech Innovator. We are an accelerator for companies in the MedTech space. That means devices, diagnostic, and digital health companies, working with startups from all over the world. We're very lucky to have the opportunity to have a number of people in our ecosystem who are very excited about startups and about innovation. We've been doing a series of talks over the last few months as part of the MedTech Innovator Live series, which this is. And in those broadcasts, we delve into topics that our startups in our program are interested in. So today we're going to be talking about reimbursement, coverage, and just in general about evidence and the needs that we would find at some of the payers and some of the hospital systems. And specifically, we're going to be digging into questions that our companies have asked. Before we get into those questions, I'm going to start off by introducing today's panelists. So we're very lucky to have two extremely distinguished panelists who are going to be here to share some of their thoughts with us today. So I'll start off first with Jo Carol Hiatt. So Jo Carol Hiatt is the chair of the National Product Council for Kaiser Permanente. She's also a surgeon and many other things, but she will tell you her background herself. So Jo Carol, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And it's an honor to be here this morning. My clinical background, as Paul said, is general surgery, but I've spent the last 20 years now in administrative roles with Kaiser Permanente, and in addition to the National Product Council, which makes all the decisions around the products, equipment, devices that we buy across our program for the care of our 12 million members. We also have another organization called the Interregional New Technologies Committee, which I have the privilege of chairing as well. And that is our internal technology assessment group. So I have background for KP with both what choices we make and what to adopt, and also looking at the evidence.
Very good. Well, we're very lucky to have you here today. Thank you very much, Jo Carol and Dr. Hiatt. So let's move on then to Deirdre Baggot. So Deirdre's a partner with Oliver Wyman, excuse me, and she'll tell you about that. Her background is really pretty extensive, so she may not get into the entire description of it. We have her full bio on our website under MedTech Innovator/live. But please go ahead, Deirdre, and just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your firm, and perhaps a little about what you do in terms of the kinds of clientele you work with.
Sure. My name is Deirdre Baggot. I'm a partner at Oliver Wyman, and after spending 10 years in academic healthcare, I moved to consultancy. Our firm is an international consultancy. As it relates to healthcare, we work with both payers and providers, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you today because we work with many tech enablement companies as they work to provide solutions for both payers and providers, particularly, I think, in the move to value-based reimbursement. So I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. I did spend several years supporting CMS in various areas, policy-related as it relates to reimbursement, particularly bundled payments. So served as an expert reviewer for CMS for several years. And so happy to discuss some of the policy issues around reimbursement and payment.
Great, thank you very much, Deirdre. So, and Jo Carol, you also have done some work with CMS or Medicare as well. Is that right?
Yes, I have. I did serve 2 terms on MedCAC, their Coverage Advisory Council, and have crossed paths with CMS many times.
So on their Coverage Advisory Council, I'm just curious, so what does that mean? What does that group do?
So that group looks at the evidence for whatever potential opportunity CMS is considering to provide something as a covered benefit for their beneficiaries. The panel for which I was asked to join and participate in was regarding the low-dose CT screening program for lung cancer. Very interesting process. The evidence was rigorously reviewed, and the panel, it was quite an interesting challenge because there was a lot of patient advocacy and industry pressure to adopt, but the evidence simply did not include the Medicare population in the studies, which is one of the challenges. We really didn't have evidence of how it would work for that group.
Excellent. Well, it's great that you've got that experience as well to share. So what we wanted to do today was really talk a little bit about reimbursement and coverage, but also generally about how technology does make it to hospital systems, health institutions, providers, and so on. So I know Joe Carroll, you have things a little different over at Kaiser Permanente. And you don't have to really think as much about reimbursement codes and coverage and things that others do. Maybe you could start by just telling us a minute or two about how you do think of things at Kaiser Permanente, if not in the world of reimbursement codes.
Sure. Well, what we're really looking for is improving the health outcomes of our population. And in addition to that, there are technologies that may do things somewhat beyond just the impacting clinical outcome, and we're very interested in those as well. If there's a significant improvement in workflow, if we can perform more procedures in a given time period with the same resources, that's of significant value to us. Our members have already paid for their care, the vast majority, and we're trying our very best to do what we can with the fiduciary responsibility that comes with that.
Excellent. So you're there to take care of people.
Yes.
All right. And so, we'll talk more about, how KP thinks of things as we go along. But I want to start off maybe by just, dealing with a little bit of the misconceptions. So I thought we could start off just with a little bit of a brief discussion on just some common misconceptions that perhaps you both run into as it relates to reimbursement and coverage. So Deirdre, I'm going to start with you and just throw that to you and say, as you're dealing with innovators, be they large or small, what are some misconceptions that you generally run into?
Well, one of them is that, payers and providers can easily adopt technology, and that we particularly in the provider space, have robust systems that support what we do. The truth of the matter is much of what we do, both on the payer and provider side, are disparate systems. I think the EHR, I would say, is, still sort of 1.0. So as it relates to technology, I think thinking that providers and payers can easily adopt technology is oftentimes not the case. And while it could be a fantastic idea, I think where we need to spend more time is how we enable payers and providers to actually take the new ideas and adopt them. How do we make that easier? I think it's and I had that when I was on the provider side. I thought, oh, payers, they could do anything, right? And they've got all these amazing systems that can support, ideas, particularly around more efficient care, more cost-effective care, reducing administrative burden as it relates to claims. But the truth of the matter is healthcare in America, it's still pretty unreliable at best, right? And part of that is the back-end systems. I think we're really good at the front-end discovery, but the back-end systems are an area that both payers and providers, are still have a lot of work to do. And so I think when you're thinking about technology, oftentimes it's not easy, and we have to do a better job of bringing our ideas to market in a way that payers and providers can actually implement.
Well said. It's something that we obviously we have a lot of innovators who are watching this webinar, and they're trying to figure out how to get their technologies into the payers and providers, and how to work with them in a way that's also making it easy for them. So I think a lot of the challenge is to understand how they think. And what the challenges they may be facing that maybe perhaps as innovators we're not aware of, or that we're certainly not our front of mind. We're thinking about maybe our particular device, but maybe not the whole picture, as you mentioned. So maybe Joe Carroll, you could take a minute and just tell us a little bit, because you have these new product councils, and I know that they're distributed, and you've got all sorts of people providing input. So when you're looking at innovative technologies, maybe just share just a little bit of the process for how something shows up. If someone's, whether, I guess it's, you can maybe take us through how these products kind of get in front of people at your level at KP. Is it started by a physician who's coming in and mentioning something, or are there salespeople knocking your door? And then kind of just give us like the basic process for how things finally make their way to being available to patients.
Sure. Well, we have a number of pathways in, and it's all of the above and a lot more. We have a venture fund, for example, that is out screening for opportunities, small startups that may, in fact, be working on something that might not catch the attention of the big Sandhill Road kinds of funding, but could be with our support, not necessarily all financial, because we don't make enormous investments, but our support in terms of the internal expertise that we can bring and help companies develop in a direction that we feel would be successful both in the market and with Kaiser Permanente. That's one path. Our physicians are involved in academic centers. A lot of our sites in California and Oregon and Hawaii are closely involved with their nearby university medical centers, medical schools. Our own School of Medicine is opening in 1 year, so we have the academic slant as well. We do a lot of research. Much of it is population research, but we also have done a number of clinical trials with both pharmaceutical companies and device companies, and that's another path. That's actually one of the ways that we've found our earliest adoption of new things is if we've been involved in the trials. And our physicians are involved in their professional societies and attend their professional events, so they approach us with ideas. And then, of course, the companies, many of the companies we work with are also looking at new technologies, new innovation, and bringing those to us as well. So it's pretty much everything you can think of. And then what we do is consider what is the potential value to KP and to our population. And as I said earlier, it really can be any number of things. We ended up adopting the robotic surgery program with Intuitive, not because we found clinical improvement at the point we started that program, but because we were concerned about recruiting and keeping urologists, and that was a reason. So it can be a broad spectrum of reasons that we adopt something.
That's great. And from a process perspective, thinking about like the value analysis world that is obviously different at every system, at every institution. Would you say KP kind of follows a similar kind of a framework though for looking at, in terms of how you then value technology? Is it in the same, I mean, would you think of it like an ACO would, or how would you describe it?
KP is probably the original ACO.
Right, yeah.
Been structured that way for over 70 years. We're looking at value really long-term. Most of our members stay with us, some for generations. And so it might be very different than a typical institution would assess something where they're looking for market leading and kind of being perceived in their community as cutting edge. Our view is different. We're looking for what is really the value to the care of our members. And it might be that the device is considerably more expensive than alternatives. And as I said, we're prepaid, so the reimbursement codes don't really matter for us. But if in fact that particular device is going to solve that problem for a patient for a much longer time frame, then it is, of course, a better choice for the patient. It might be something like a pacemaker with a longer battery life. On the other hand, we've looked at our data. We have registries to look at our implants, And it turns out that once we hit about 7 years battery life in pacemakers, the vast majority, there are very few patients, sadly, that survive that first device. So paying extra for a 15-year battery makes no sense in that circumstance. Sad but true.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you. So let's shift over to you, Deirdre, for a second. So, we talked a little about misconceptions. So if you're advising, a client, whether it's a startup or anybody else, but someone who's coming in, and you've got them early. So, you're not coming in to fix mistakes they've made, 4 years later. You got them early. What are some general tips that you offer to people as a way to say, hey, got you early. These are some things you can do to kind of plan ahead that are going to make your path to that ultimate coverage and reimbursement successful. So what are some general tips you give people?
The first and foremost, particularly with innovators, and I usually have to repeat myself hundreds of times, is you have to be solving a problem. Whether your target is Kaiser or a payer or a provider, if you're not solving a problem for them, it could be a great idea and you are not going to gain traction. And so I've worked with lots of enablement companies that have an idea that's maybe okay or that's partially baked, or maybe it's a great idea, but a payer doesn't have the systems to actually implement it. And truth be told, while it may solve some of the problem for a payer, it doesn't really solve a problem for a payer in a meaningful way. I think you really have to look at, for payers and providers and also for consumers, how do you best solve their problem? That's how you'll gain traction. And I would say, we sit with payers often. And so if we are pitching to them some solution that's going to save them money per se, for example, if it's not going to save them significant money, they're usually not that interested. They have innovators in front of them, hundreds every week knocking on their door, right? And so I think you have to solve a problem first and foremost in a really meaningful way. I think for both payers and providers, I don't care if they, how much they talk about quality and cost effectiveness, which absolutely agree that quality should come first. What I have found in the last 10 years with both payers and providers, at the end of the day, what they're most consumed with is how do they be most cost effective and how do they reduce their spend. So I think consumers' experience is important. I think what's most important to both payers and providers is how they manage total cost of care. And so innovations that help manage care more cost effectively, I think are sticky. And I think if you're going to get in front of a payer or provider, you have to have a great pitch. What I see oftentimes with innovators is they don't put enough time into their pitch. And then that the solution doesn't solve enough of a problem for a payer or provider against the other 100 solutions that are put in front of them every week. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Could I jump in, Paul?
Yeah, please go, Carol. Yeah.
I agree that total cost of care is important, but one of the core values within Kaiser Permanente that I'm really proud of is that we have this fundamental belief that a meaningful improvement in quality will somewhere reduce cost. It may not be obvious early, but somewhere there will be value if it's a meaningful improvement in quality. The other thing I wanted to mention is put in a plug for the FDA's pre-submission process and working with their payer provider communication task force, which is available for anyone that's planning to submit to the FDA. You can invite the payers to be present during the pre-submission meeting with FDA, and those pre-submission meetings, I'm sure Deirdre knows this as well, can be extremely helpful in designing trials that will most effectively get through the FDA approval process. And then the engagement of the payers early, and I've spent considerable time meeting with different companies either ahead of their pre-submission meeting and or during the pre-submission meeting, and then some follow-up. We can help design the trials so that when the results are available, if in fact the data show good evidence of value and impact on outcomes, we're ready to go. They don't have to do additional studies necessarily.
It's great. So maybe expanding on that just briefly. So that task force that you mentioned, and you're personally, working with some of these startups or other innovators, when they're at the pre-sub stage. So did they go through FDA, and then FDA reaches out to you, and then you get involved? How do you get into that loop?
Exactly. The FDA website for this task force has a link to submit indication of interest, and in some circumstances, the companies are more comfortable if there's a really tight NDA put in place before they speak with me, and that's fine. My personal preference, if the companies are comfortable with it, because as I said earlier, my background's general surgery, and I certainly am not the world's expert in any of the conditions that tend to come through this way, and or the technologies. And I would like to be able to include one or two of my colleagues who really are experts in that particular area to help provide some input, but that's up to the companies.
That's great. So, related to that question then is probably the most asked question, which is how do you get in front of insurers or providers, or I should say, payers in general? How do you get in front of them? And maybe Deirdre, I'll go back to you for that. So what's the best way for startups to do that?
Well, I have a bias. Not everybody may agree with me, but when I think about speed to market and effectiveness and hit rate, if I'm going to spend the time to get in front of a payer or provider, I want to do it right out of the gate in the first time. And so, and we do get calls from lots of innovators for help with this. My bias is that you find whomever has the best relationship with the target, right? So, and leverage that relationship. So, we have clients that may want to work with a particular employer, and what our firm does is look at who in the firm has the best, strongest relationship with that employer. So I think it makes a lot of sense. It gives you speed to market to look at who does have a relationship with, the target that you're attempting to get in front of, and how do you leverage that? Who does have trust? So I have the providers that I've worked with for 10 years and that trust me and know that I wouldn't put something in front of them that I didn't believe in. And so I think, my suggestion is to find out who has those relationships and leverage those relationships. That will give you tremendous speed to market. And
would it also be a physician, perhaps a clinician who, is a good entry point for that?
That's a great, yeah, I think payers in particular, they really care about their relationships with providers. And I think particularly if it's something to do with, quality or clinical outcomes, a physician adds a lot of credibility. So yeah, there are lots of times I do that where I think that a physician or someone that has the expertise in a particular area is the right person to have the conversation. I think we get in a hurry and we think about quantity, and we're going to take the shotgun approach and get in front of as many targets as possible. I think you'd be really smart with your pitch and have the right person that has the relationship. But yeah, you do bring up a great point. Oftentimes, clinicians have a level of credibility that others don't.
And I guess maybe I already know the answer to this, Joe Carroll, because you've said this a little bit, but it sounds like you work with people at a pretty early stage. I guess the question is when is it too early? What's the right time?
Well, I think there needs to be at least some promising data. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human clinical trial. I'm involved with the NIH, which has an accelerator fund for academic centers typically that have done some bench research, and it looks like there may be some promising opportunity to commercialize what the taxpayers have invested in here. And it's bridge funding. And so we review various proposals. That's very early. Some of this is really basic research that I really am not the right expert to understand even whether they're likely to be able to cure cancer someday or not, but those are interesting, and I'm happy to support that work. We do look fairly early. The venture fund tends to wait until at least the second round of funding for a startup, not jump in super early. The venture fund has a website and can be contacted through that, and if they're interested, they'll follow up. But those are what I don't recommend, and there are companies that do this. They figure out the CEO's email address or one of the executive medical directors, and they fire off basically a cold call email introducing their technology and asking to meet with the very senior executives. That's not the best way to go.
Yeah, generally
I would concur. I would concur with that.
Yeah, I was going to say the CEO is usually the worst way in for almost any particular context, especially because even, we tell people this all the time, people will, they're interested in, maybe doing a business development deal or something. And it's just as you said, they find the CEO's address, they contact them. The worst thing that can happen is, in general, that the person who they then reach out to say follow up on this, now really has very little incentive because it's not their idea. They've been told to go do it. And don't go through the CEO in general.
The one thing I would add to what Joe Carroll said, because I think this does come up, is when you think about, getting into an organization, we can just pick on physicians for the sake of this conversation. For a physician or for someone in Joe Carroll's role to be able to sell it internally, having some proof of concept or some data makes that lift much easier. And so I would concur that, you don't have to have long longitudinal studies, but some proof of concept and some data makes whomever you're partnering with to sort of socialize your solution. It just makes their work so much easier. Many physicians say, in order for me to sell this to my colleagues or my peers internally, I need some data to do that. So we oftentimes recommend to startups, if they haven't started a study. I worked with a orthopedic implant company, international company, and they didn't have U.S. studies, right? They had some studies in China. And so we recommended that they rapidly identify some providers in America and start to do some research in America. So I do think, I don't know, Joe Carroll, if you would agree, but I think for physicians, it's really hard to sell something to their peers if they don't have data to support it.
Yeah, I agree, Deirdre. I don't think that we require U.S. studies for that initial look, especially if we're considering an internal clinical trial or the U.S. studies are about to be launched and we've been invited to possibly participate. I know I've mentioned a couple times that we do studies not in phase 1 or 2. For devices, we would want to be at least at phase 3. We want to be sure we're not putting our members at significant risk, but we have very sophisticated research infrastructure in several of our regions, and we do a lot of work. The funding, of course, is typical with the massive overhead that academic medical centers require. We're the same. We're not a cut rate version of that. But for us, the real investment is the time of our staff, because our physicians and others working for KP, we were all hired to take care of our patients. And research is something that we strongly support and we invest in, but the physicians have day jobs, and for them to devote what ends up being a lot of personal time to take on the role of a principal investigator and a study is a big commitment. And so we're careful about protecting them from things, and they know, and it's not uncommon to have something that really looks interesting, but we just don't have the bandwidth due to other demands on our time to take on more trials at certain points.
Great. So let's move on a little bit to some other topics. So one of them has to do with reimbursement. And I think it still will apply to you a bit here, Joe Carroll, but I'll start with Deirdre. And so the question is does reimbursement from one carrier or payer influence others? So why don't we start with you on that?
Well, certainly, I think, probably the biggest influencer as it comes to reimbursement is Medicare, right? I think as goes Medicare, so goes healthcare. So I think as a payer, we oftentimes, whether it's code sets or specs or approaches to copays, I see commercial payers every day sort of looking at the way, Medicare has approached a particular reimbursement issue. So I look at Medicare as sort of the leader in that area. And Medicaid also obviously follows Medicare. In terms of reimbursement in general, I think we could all agree that we could do that a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more simple, particularly for patients with chronic diseases. Receiving multiple claims, is really, really tough. And so I think ways in which reimbursement can be less cumbersome, both for payers and for clinicians and providers, I think there's lots of opportunity there. What we see, particularly with really both public and private payers, is that the system has, to some extent, the cumbersomeness of the system has to do with wanting some controls and assurance of appropriateness of care. And so I think that's our role as providers, is to think about how we can assure payers that the care we're providing is necessary, and that we're not overusing the system, and that it's appropriate. But my bias is that it's much too complex, and I think we hear that from consumers. And I think for particularly, as I mentioned, for patients with chronic diseases, we owe it to them to do a better job in streamlining, making it more simple. I don't know, Joe Carroll, if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I do. I will say, with regard to CMS decisions, we certainly are knowledgeable about what CMS has decided to reimburse for, and for some of the procedures such as TAVR, the valve replacements, transcatheter valves. Those had requirements for submitting data and the follow-up registry, et cetera, that we're compliant with. But I will say that we do not, just because Medicare CMS has decided that something is going to be reimbursed, that doesn't mean we're going to make it available to every Medicare beneficiary. Good example is virtual colonoscopy, which requires a CT scan, a lot of radiation exposure, a whole lot of incidental findings that have their own complications. And in our system, we have extraordinarily high colon cancer screening rates and success without virtual colonoscopy, with the rare situation where, because of anatomy or some unique circumstance, the patient simply can't undergo a traditional exam. Then we'll use it if they're high risk. So we don't necessarily take a CMS decision and just implement. We do think about what the evidence shows and where it fits in. We do have a bit of a different spin on the question about what decisions have been made by other insurers. For some conditions, if we were to adopt a technology that's very specific to a condition and no other insurer is providing it as yet, we have to think about adverse selection, where patients with that condition would be incentivized to join KP, and we would have a very skewed population. As much as we want to provide the right care for everybody, we can't be the only one covering the expensive hemophiliac drugs, for example. It would be really quite a problem for us to be in that circumstance. So we want to do the right thing, but we don't necessarily want to be the only provider in that circumstance.
That's a great point.
It makes a lot of sense. So when you think about, you mentioned internal studies before, Joe Carroll. So one of the questions someone asked was whether or not payers will help pay for studies for technologies they believe can help their populations. So
we will. If it really does look like it's going to bring tremendous value to us, we will support. We won't necessarily be able to fully fund a large study that would be the only source of FDA approval, but we do subsidize.
And I would say we've seen that with other payers as well. So I would agree that we do see payers willing to invest when it makes sense for them from a business standpoint.
And Carol, when you say that you'll help fund some of those studies, would you do that then as KP Ventures, or is that something that you just do as KP?
As KP, the Ventures group actually, they stay away from having any trials within KP for the companies in which they've invested.
Great.
It's mutually exclusive.
Makes a lot of sense. And what about let's talk a little about evidence, because I think that's on everyone's mind. So Deirdre, I'm going to start with you. One of the questions that was asked was really talking about the kind of the quality. Well, they asked about the quality of the evidence necessary for CMS. I think maybe in general what we're trying to get at here is you mentioned before outside the U.S. data, other things. What's generally involved with what you would consider to be high quality data that would be satisfactory for an agency like CMS or others?
Maybe I'd let Joe Carroll take a stab at that. I don't know exactly the specs on what CMS requires, the number of sample size in a population. I can tell you, typically with payers and providers, they do want, prior studies, whether it's a new device or a new drug, a new technology. So software is one that comes to mind. They certainly don't want to be, bleeding edge, but I don't know the specific specs on what CMS requires. Joe Carroll might be able to speak to Kaiser's position.
Well, for CMS, my experience on the MedTech panel was interesting because they have some very sophisticated analytic support in CMS, and they had gone through all the available literature and really dug into the data and displayed it in English. It was really quite amazing. The key thing that I mentioned earlier is that really the studies had essentially excluded age over 65. And there are many reasons that these things happen. A lot of studies are done excluding pregnant women and women in general, or women of childbearing age, and all kinds of segments of the population for whom the technology or medication might in fact provide significant benefit, but the additional risk of studying those populations is so daunting that the companies are afraid to include them. And I don't disagree, I understand that. But when we're trying to make a decision about the evidence, that's a significant factor. So that's what CMS does. In our situation, the other factors we need to consider, some years ago, there was some really interesting data from the UK around using computer-assisted detection in mammography for mammography screening for breast cancer and identifying possibly things that the radiologists may have missed. And the workflow that they used in the UK was unique in that they already had a system where they were double reading. 2 radiologists were looking at every exam already. And then when they applied the CAD markings to the images, the radiologist, one of them went back and after 2 had read it and looked at that and determined whether in fact there was anything additional there. The problem with that literature, and it did show some increase in finding things, but there was no evidence that in fact it changed the ultimate outcome. In other words, maybe something was found earlier, but one of the sad stories in mammography is that a lot of the promising results that are shown with early detection have not in fact shown higher survival. The better survival that we're seeing today is because of better chemotherapy, not because of better detection. And so the speculation is that most of this early detection is creating what we call lead time bias, meaning that the women know earlier that they have breast cancer, but whether they do well or not is basically already determined from other factors. And that's sad and unfortunate. We did not adopt CAD at that time, even though it looked promising from the UK results, because we were not doing double reads. And we knew from the sites that we visited that once it was on the equipment in a radiologist's office, they never waited to review it first. They always had it marked first and then looked at the images. And they ended up missing things that the CAD didn't mark because they were distracted by the markings. And that, in fact, ended up with worse results. So we never adopted it then. With artificial intelligence, that's gotten a lot better. And I think there's some benefits of that sort of technology, but we're looking for evidence where it's going to bring value. So to stay on that example briefly, where I think that kind of technology is going to help us is if we can apply AI immediately while the woman is still in the exam room and flag for the technologist that perhaps additional views or other studies are needed, or maybe even a biopsy, so that that woman doesn't have to go home and get a phone call in a few days, schedule another appointment and all of that. I think we're going to see an opportunity in the workflow and in the patient experience to really help people by flagging things with AI.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful. I'm hopeful with AI too. I think the AI ability to help manage populations and really big data and analytics necessary to manage populations, I think there's a lot of promise there.
I do as well. And we have a lot of innovators who are on this webinar who themselves are banking on AI's ability to help with this. So that's great to hear. So maybe going back to the questions again. So one of the questions that somebody asked was about the technology assessment, and Deirdre, how that fits into CMS coding and coverage.
Well, so technology assessment, I mean, telehealth would be a really good example of that probably, but so if you're assessing the technology from a provider standpoint, certainly where, and TAVR would be another example, sort of where we're at with respect to whether or not the technology could be reimbursed and the timeline for that whole process, I think impacts adoption rates. Telehealth is something that's still really catching up in terms of reimbursement. I don't know the details on how you go about working with CMS. Certainly, as it relates to that process, certainly my experience with CMS is that they are interested. The Innovation Center is always very interested and we've been working with CMS on telehealth and telehealth reimbursement, and they very much are interested and know that they need to understand and advance their thinking around reimbursement, similar to ASCs a couple years ago. I think you've got to sit down with my suggestion is you sit down with, leaders at CMS and CMMI and talk to them and explain. I think they obviously are interested. I think that my sense is they have so much on their plate. But where I've done some work in the last few years is both with telehealth and then with ASCs and reimbursement in the ASC environment. And in both instances, it was really just a matter of helping CMS understand and helping CMMI understand. And oftentimes what they're looking for is not to necessarily re-explain the problem, but to give them actual solutions. So when I sit down with folks at CMS or the Innovation Center, particularly if we just pick on telehealth for a minute, I usually try to take them a solution because they want to do the right thing. They just all have a lot on their plates. So Karen, would you say that's your experience as well?
Well, we've had some interesting conversations, and I think unfortunately, CMS has to comply with what the statute says and their interpretation of what Congress has imposed on them, which may or may not be a rational rule interpretation, but it's what it is. And with telehealth, because I worked on this for years, I launched telehealth for Southern California, and we were precluded from offering telehealth to any of our Medicare beneficiaries unless they lived in a rural zip code, which is defined in such a way that none of our members live in a rural zip code in Southern California. I think there are a handful in Northern California, but our system is designed to provide care where we can get to the members and they can get to us. And so we really don't have people in Fairbanks, Alaska that are KP members, and for that exact reason. So we met with them and tried to get permission to offer telehealth to our Medicare Advantage members who were not interested in coming in for appointments if they didn't have to. They were perfectly happy to have a video visit or something else. But the Medicare perspective was, we have to comply with this statute. The statute was put in place to prevent fraud and to prevent abuse of the depriving our beneficiaries of the services for which they have paid and the government has paid. So that's the statute interpretation they were working from. That has finally gotten better, but sometimes the apparent CMS reluctance to do something is not because they don't understand it, it's because they interpret statute in a way that prevents them from adopting it.
Agree. Yeah.
Well, speaking of statutes and some changes and things that are coming along that affect everybody, I want to talk a little bit about bundled payments, and it's something that I think both of you probably have some real experience in. So maybe Jill Carroll, I'll start with you, and just or between the two of you, you can talk about it. It's up to you who wants to go first. But bundled payments in general, just talk about trends and how that's going to affect things in reimbursement in general and adoption.
Well, this one I'm gonna decline, Paul, because
I
am completely shielded from bundled payments, and we've already been paid.
I'll happily take that. Thank you. Yeah, take that one on. So there's been more than 30 years of research in this area of reimbursement. So what most people don't know is that when CMS rolled out fee-for-service, they didn't actually intend to pay Part A, which is sort of the hospital, and Part B, which is the physician, separately. That was really the act of physicians and the AMA. So there's been 30 years of study with a fixed payment or a bundle payment. Most of that research is really in elective procedures. CMS did, with the help of Congress, Senate Finance Committee, move dialysis to a bundle payment in 2011, 2012, I forget the year. So dialysis is largely paid as a bundle payment. Orthopedics, joint replacement all over the country. So CMS has been studying this reimbursement model. Their two major strategies are really sort of the ACO, or total cost of care model, and then bundles. When you think of the fee-for-service population, obviously MA is MA. But I would say most of the literature is around elective procedures. There's been fewer studies when it comes to populations with chronic disease other than what I mentioned, which is dialysis. What we see with a bundle payment for patients is they don't have to deal with, so for example, the cystic fibrosis population, lots of claims every week, every month, very expensive pharma. The notion that a family and a child with cystic fibrosis can have one claim is something that's very appealing to them, and probably the right thing to do to not burden them. I think for commercial payers, they don't have systems to date that really support it. There are a few technologies that we are watching that we're hopeful will make administering or auto-adjudicating a bundle easier. But there's certainly literature to support the reimbursement model, and I would just say most of it has been done in cancer, oncology, or cancer, ortho, and cardiac. I think we definitely need technology around auto adjudication of claims, and then I think for payers in general, while they're interested, their systems don't today support it by and large. And so it's going to just take us some time to catch up from a technology standpoint. Does that help?
It does. It does help. Yeah. I think, we're, everyone's trying to figure out, where the next, what's going to be bundled next. And are they going to be subject to that? And that's, that I guess none of us have a complete crystal ball into the future, but that's, I think, something that people are wondering.
Yeah, I think oncology and chronic disease, I think ortho, will continue with joints. I think there's a lot of interest in oncology. Breast cancer is an example. There are several employers that are testing various chemo and oncology related bundles. I think spine is another area that there's a lot of interest among payers. So I think we'll continue to see spine evolving, oncology, ortho, and cardiac.
Thank you. We talked earlier, you were in the beginning, you were mentioning that you spend a lot of time thinking about, what payers want and, what's going to make their life easier. So maybe you could share some of your thinking there, Deirdre.
Well, I think for both payers and providers, I think technologies are solutions that help them, be high value providers and high value and for payers to do what they do, in a high value manner. I think for providers, think about physicians or hospital providers, what they are really trying to learn and build competency around is managing total cost of care, particularly across the continuum. And historically, they have not really managed big data. So for a health system, other than Kaiser and a few others, managing big data is new to them. And so I think that's where AI becomes very appealing and helping, with complex analytics. I think for payers, they too are interested in, managing total cost of care for populations. I think the whole area of care management and how we do that better so that patients don't come back, we avoid ER visits and prevent readmissions. I think there's a lot of need in the marketplace to sort of figure out that how best to care manage populations. And then I think, and then things that I mentioned before, sort of as we think about new methodologies around reimbursement for payers, how do we make it easier for them and consider their current systems? I think is something that we just have to grapple with.
So if I could make a couple of comments, KP's been dealing with mountains and mountains of data for decades. We've been fully electronic on electronic medical record for quite some time now, and we had a lot of systems in place before we adopted Epic. In fact, we tried every electronic medical record out there until we finally settled on Epic, and we have a lot of experience with data. What we don't have is great, useful information from some of that data. Epic was, as those of you that have used it at all, it was developed as a system for Judy Faulkner's pediatrician husband in Madison, Wisconsin, for his little practice, and very focused on that individual patient-physician interaction. And for years, we've been working to try and, as our former CIO said, free the data where we could actually work with it. And we're getting there. It's much better. But we have invested a lot of time and resources into doing that. There also is tremendous concern in Kaiser Permanente and other organizations around cybersecurity. And while AI is very appealing, it also means opening pathways in and out to our systems that KP is very reluctant to do. So I don't think in the near future we're going to be doing much work with any organizations or platforms that require a potential breach in our firewall and cybersecurity. We have very strict requirements for what's allowed to connect onto our network, and wireless protocols, the whole thing, that are we are told by every supplier that we we talk to that has some great solution, that ours are the strictest in the industry, and that they're too strict and they have no plans to meet it. And we said, okay, good luck, you're out of here. And we won't work with them.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's it's a general question. So, you mentioned cybersecurity and breaching your firewalls and things. So for most devices these days are collecting data. I mean, almost all of them are, right? Even sponges. And you have to have some mechanism then for getting data back to not just to you, but also probably to the originator of those technologies in some cases. So in your case, you're firewalling, you're saying nothing gets out.
Well, not nothing, Paul, but very little. So the sponges, that data doesn't go out. We installed that system. We required the supplier to provide us a system that could be completely independent of theirs. Interesting.
That's great. So, and is that pretty common, Deirdre, in your experience as well? When you, I don't know if you've dealt with that particular issue as it comes to payers. Are people continue? Are we moving more towards like kind of the cloud-based reporting solutions, or are people still? Or you think there's still a lot of systems that are requiring people to bring software behind their firewall?
I think both. The sponge example makes me laugh, but both. I think we don't have any clients who aren't, both payers and providers, very serious about cybersecurity. And I also think Epic's a great example where I think for many clients it hasn't delivered on maybe what they had hoped, and they're looking for more cloud-based solutions. But I will say, I think healthcare in particular, there's just a lot of, we have many clients who are really reevaluating, every time there's a security breach, right? Our clients are going back to the drawing board and reevaluating their cybersecurity policies. So it's a little bit of a both and, but really just our clients are just trying to be really careful and make sure that they are protecting their patients and their members and their health data.
That's great. Thank you for that. One other area I want to talk about briefly are diagnostics, and so quickly, maybe perhaps one of the questions people have in general about are usually related to lab developed LDTs, and so I guess maybe just in general I'll throw it to both of you. In terms of LDTs, maybe first Joe Carroll for you, is that something that KP do you use it? You work with a lot of LDTs. Is that something you see increasing? And then I'll go to Deirdre for that.
I think it will increase, especially some of the companion diagnostics that go with the pharmaceuticals, which may or may not have real value. I've asked point blank a couple of times whether this is just a ploy to get permanent patent life on the drug, which it may be. But we certainly, first of all, we operate two massive internal regional labs in Northern and Southern California that are second only to Quest and ARUP or LabCorp and Quest. We're bigger than ARUP in terms of the volume that we process. And so we have a lot of experience and expertise in our organization for doing a great deal of the lab testing internally, and of course the proprietary things and some of the areas where it just at this point doesn't make sense to internalize. We are sending out, but we've purchased a bunch of the gene sequencing equipment, and we're doing a fair amount ourselves. So we will look at the LDTs with the same expectation around evidence of how it's going to help us.
Great. And Deirdre, anything you?
Yeah, I think our clients are looking at in the same spot. So our clients are looking at it. I think anything where.
Can you hear me?
It's me. No, I got you. Go ahead.
Yeah. From a diagnostic standpoint, I think what our clients are looking at is, and particularly as it relates to lab, is is what does the patient actually need? Oftentimes what happens is providers learn in their training, some protocol around labs and maybe continue that for many, many years. I think about my time at Northwestern and, every patient got daily labs, right? We don't do that today. So I think there's two things that our clients are looking at, both payers and providers, are really how do we ensure that from a diagnostic standpoint that we're giving patients exactly what they need and nothing that they don't. And then if there are technologies that enable us to do that more cost effectively or enable us to reach populations, I think about colon cancer as an example, reach populations where we really do want to get, screening done. I think technologies that offer a more cost-effective mechanism to do that or expand reach, I think are interesting and compelling for payers and providers.
Great. So we're going to wrap up the public part of our broadcast in a minute. So as we're doing that, then we'll transition to more of the nuanced questions, and we'll do that off. It's just a private discussion. So before we wrap up the public one, just a couple quick things. So Joe Carroll, you mentioned before, some of your work with FDA and the payer task force. Maybe one question we can just quickly tackle is, any advice you have for companies related to, people who are kind of seeking that parallel review or just thinking about that?
So parallel review is a little different, and I have not been part of that. Parallel review is working with FDA and CMS concurrently to try, as I understand it, as I said, I don't know a great deal about the reimbursement, but to try and achieve CMS perspective around coverage and reimbursement at the same time, so that at the point that FDA approval is achieved, it would potentially be able to be reimbursed. I know Medtronic has done that with their renal denervation program, and I'm not sure of how many others have. So that's the parallel review. The Payer Communication Task Force, the FDA has some nice information on their website, and that's easily found by just Dr. Google, FDA Payer Task Force, and the submission process is outlined there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate your making the distinction there as I was rushing to do that question. And Deirdre, anything else from you then on maybe on just the parallel review topic? Is that something that your clients are doing more often? Any suggestions or advice?
Our clients are just interested and eager. I wouldn't say I have anything to necessarily add to what Joe Carroll referenced, but certainly our clients have interest in anything that sort of expedites, getting to policy. Getting there faster, yeah, agreed. And then so last thing before we wrap up the public discussion. So we've talked a lot about advice. Are there first of all, anything come to mind? Anything that you wanted to talk about before that you didn't share quickly? Anything you want to make sure people know before we sign off from the public broadcast? Either of you?
No, I don't think so.
The only thing I think for innovators that I always think that we could do better is really listening to providers, and when you're meeting with payers and providers, I think first and foremost, listen to what their problems are. I'm not sure that we're always really good at that. I think we get excited about our technology or our innovation, and we're so eager to share it. But I think it's really helpful to first and foremost listen to both payers and providers and what they're struggling with day to day. I think that is usually very helpful.
That's great. Thank you very much. If our startups want to reach out to you directly, is that something that would be all right with you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think in my case, it would probably be best through the FDA process, because that is something that I would hope that they would also be interested in.
That'd be great. Very good. All right. Well, thank you both for your time. As I mentioned, we're going to be jumping off to a private chat, so don't disconnect, both of you. And for anyone else who's on the webinar, who's just watching these videos on our YouTube channel, I want to make sure we remind you that medtechinnovator.org/live is the place to go to see the schedule of upcoming webinars. We'll be talking about sales and market access next. And then we'll be talking about the M&A process as well, which I know is a very a topic that a lot of people are thinking about. So please tune in for that in the coming weeks, same time on Thursdays, 10:30 Pacific. And other than that, we're going to sign off from the live broadcast and continue on the private chat. So thanks everyone for tuning in today.